talking with a whole lot of truth. Remedy Revolution is here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Erin Page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Remedy Revolution podcast. My name is Erin, and today's guest I'm really excited about. It's really kind of a full circle moment for me. When my son was first diagnosed with PANS about 13 years ago, and we were experiencing lots and lots of behavioral challenges, anger and aggression, and really difficult kinds of things. One of the very first resources that was given to us was actually the book Disconnected Kids. And so I'm really excited to have its author, Dr. Robert Melillo, here today to speak to us about how so many of these kids can restructure their brains in order to have so much better function and, create so much more harmony within the family. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Robert Melillo.
My pleasure, and I love that story, so thank you. But yes, I'm very excited to be here as well.
Okay, so let's just kind of talk about some of the challenges that bring people to see you. So I want to kind of get into right brain versus left brain domination and what we see with those particular kids and how we then kind of bring them back into a state of balance.
Yeah, well, as you're saying, from my perspective, it really all, stems from the brain, right? So the brain ultimately is what we need to look at and ultimately understand what is happening in the brain in the individual patient or in the child. To me, if you don't really understand what that core problem is in the brain, then you're just really managing symptoms. You're not really dealing with the root cause. So what I've always been in search of is the root cause and the real root cause. And to me, it comes down to looking at two primary things: any sort of alteration in normal maturity and development in the brain, where it could be slowed down or sped up, or the sequences in the way the brain is supposed to develop is altered. And in the human brain, that's more important than any other brain on the planet, and we can talk about that. But then how that may alter the development of the hemispheres and the interaction and the functional connectivity between networks in the hemispheres. I mean, since basically the late 80s and 90s, all of the research into mental health, development, or neurodevelopmental issues has always spoke about problems with functional connectivity as the root problem. Not a lesion in the brain, not injury, not genetic mutations, but actually the way the brain and networks communicate and talk. And the reason for that usually is something in development. Like we even know that, 90% at least of adult mental health issues really start in childhood. Mm-hmm. And it really comes down to these imbalances in these networks where certain areas are overactive and produce symptoms from that, or underdeveloped and producing symptoms from that. And because the brain and the way the brain works, it regulates everything. Dysregulation of the immune system, of the gut, of the digestive system, of the autonomic system, of the detox system, ultimately really starts in the brainstem and in the brain with these imbalances.
So when you have someone present to you, how do you determine what kinds of symptoms or signs would you look for if somebody is right brain dominant versus left brain dominant?
Yeah, so let's make a definition a little bit more clearer. I believe all of us are either more left brain or right brain dominant from what we call a cognitive style. Basically, the way we view the world, the way we think, our preferences in life really speak to, are we seeing the world through more of a right brain lens or a left brain lens? There's nothing wrong with either one of those. We want people that in this world that are left brain dominant, that are kind of have an engineering type of brain, the logical, linear, person that is very detail oriented, that's very persistent and goal directed and all of that. We want people that are more right brain, that are more social, that are more empathetic, that are more big picture type person, that may have some more creativity in certain areas, or that are more, physical and think more in a more common sense, practical ways, right? So we have differences in that. That's good. But when we have deficits or imbalances, where the right brain may become too dominant and the left brain, and that's because usually there's a delay in the left side, or vice versa, then we get a combination of symptoms. So if we look at someone with a right brain delay or a left brain overactivity, because they always come together,
Right.
that would be someone that might fit more of a classic ADHD, hyperactive, impulsive. OCD, someone very obsessive, compulsive. The classic autism spectrum disorder person, which is usually a combination of that, like stimming, tics, OCD, hyperactivity. We also see, again, those people are hyper focused on details. When we look at, people that might also have schizophrenia, that may, lose touch with reality. There's other things like that. And then the deficit on the right side associated with that is that they may, lack some emotional regulation. They don't have that same social drive, or they may not read social cues appropriately in a way, or not at all in some cases. They may have, trouble seeing the big picture, or thinking in common sense ways, or they take everything literally and don't understand humor or metaphor. And so, again, this is what we see in something like autism or ADHD or OCD or tics or Tourette's or things like that. Or specific, I tend to look at things from an advanced neuroanatomy perspective. So, like if we look at something like tics or stimming or hyperactivity physically, there's an area of the brain on the left side called Brodmann area 6, the supplemental motor area, which is connected to an area called the basal ganglia through something called the direct pathway. That's overactive, and it's underactive on the right side. And that's where actually tics and stimming and hyperactivity come from. In the more frontal area, in an area called dorsolateral and orbital frontal, that's where obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors come from, right? So again, there's because of deficits on the right. So example of a right brain deficit with overactive left brain.
So then do you see people with deficits or dominance in certain areas of the right or left hemisphere, and then inverted in other areas of the right and left hemisphere?
Yeah, we do see that, depending on their natural traits. I look at, even though we talk about right and left brain, I look at it as there's like 7 different different features of right brain cognitive style and left brain. So there's like subtypes of that, right? Like personality types. You may get a right brain dominant person that's extremely social, but not artistic, not creative, not athletic, not incredibly inventive. You can get someone that might be, a songwriter that's an incredible musician, but can't draw worth a lick, but may be very social. So, we have different areas of that brain that represent different networks. We have at least 9 different and probably more major networks in the brain, and there's some sub-networks. And some of them are more dominant on the right side, some on the left side. So the way those networks connect or don't connect can make very different features.
Sure.
Why we look at everybody, every kid is individualized, but there are global patterns that we can recognize. And those global patterns usually fit based on right brain and left brain. And the reason for that is, the right brain develops first in the first 3 years, and then the left brain develops next. And so if anything alters that, that can impact the way those hemispheres, but then it's superimposed on natural traits. And in general, I always say that these imbalances really start in individuals that are gifted. I mean, almost every patient we work with, unless they have a clear-cut genetic disorder or a brain injury, they really starts with them being unusually strong in a certain area, in certain networks, and that runs in their family somewhere. And then that may become too dominant and too strong, and then that may lead to a deficit on the other side. And so that leads to imbalance. Like Simon Baron-Cohen out of Cambridge showed in the 90s that in families of kids with autism, there was a much higher percentage of people that were physicists, mathematicians, and engineers. Also later showed that people that are in the finance world and doctors and lawyers. He also then showed that anywhere in the world there's a cluster of people that work in the IT industry, that there's a dramatic rise in those areas of autism. What do all those jobs or occupations have in common? They're all left brain dominant skills. So those traits are there, and we see that that's a good thing. But if you get too much of that trait, it can lead to a deficit on the other side, and vice versa. Bipolar, dyslexia, we see these are people that are more right brain dominant in their thinking styles.
So tell us a little bit, for those that are unfamiliar, what are primitive reflexes and how does addressing those help resolve some of these deficits?
Sure. Human brain is unique in the way it grows and develops. One, we have the largest brain per body size of any primate, but because we have the smallest, because we're bipedal, we have the smallest birth canal. So right from the beginning, it's much more difficult and challenging for human babies than any other animal. No other animal has to deal with that. So the genes that regulate our brain development have been changed in a way where they have to be more sensitive so that they keep the brain restricted in growth in the womb and then grow mostly outside the womb. And so when a human brain is born, it's only about 20-25% of adult size. Every other animal, most of their brain development happens in the womb in a controlled setting, and most of their brain is developed when they're born. Humans, 80% of our brain development happens outside of the womb in an uncontrolled setting. And that is the most important part. And the biggest areas, like all of our cognitive skills, are the ones that develop exclusively out in the environment. So anything that alters brain development is going to have a big impact on the emergence of those cognitive skills later on, right? And so to initiate that, we have to move. That's what initiates brain development. But the problem is, like a horse will run in less than 2 hours after they're born. Humans won't walk until 12 months. The part of our brain, the motor cortex, that would allow us to walk isn't there when we're born. So we need to move to engage our genes and engage the world and build our brain, but we don't have the motor cortex. So what's the answer? We're born with these things called primitive reflexes, and they allow us to move and survive and feed ourselves and get into the right position in the womb for us to be born, help ourselves get out of the womb, and then when we're out, latch on and breastfeed to feed ourselves, and then roll over and do the commando crawl. And all of those are led by primitive reflexes that allow for basic, simple program movements that get us through the first year. And then at the end of the first year, right around 11 to 13 months, a child should be able to walk a few steps independently, talk and say a few words, 3 to 5, and they should point and have good eye contact and waving. And they should then, once that's maintained, they shouldn't lose any of that, right? If they don't hit those milestones, if they don't reach it, It's usually because these reflexes haven't come on when they're supposed to. And so it causes a delay in development. And we keep on getting further and further and further behind. And then at one, if they don't go away, we may not hit that milestone. We may walk, but we don't talk. We may walk and talk, but we don't point and have eye contact. Or we may seem like we do those things, and then suddenly, anywhere between 1 and 2 years, we may lose them all of a sudden. Because when these reflexes don't go away, they now hold the brain back. And they also can interfere with this balance so that, for instance, if the right brain is taking the lead, the right brain keeps the left brain from coming on at that point. But if both sides of the brain are pushed down or stopped, now the left brain may come online too early, especially in someone that's gifted in their left brain. And now that pushes the right brain down, and now there won't be any further development, or they may lose a lot of skills that they've already gained. Or it can go the other way, where the right brain gets too strong and the left brain gets interfered with, and that can lead to a left brain delay. So that's the importance of primitive reflexes. All of us have them. We've known about them for a long time. If a child goes to see the pediatric neurologist in the first year, they've checked for all of them, but they are taught and believe that those reflexes automatically go away at one all the time in every child, and they are never retained beyond one. Other people have known for years, and my research, I've done more research on this than anybody in the world, has proven that retained reflexes, that in especially in neurodevelopmental disorders, in kids and adults, because if they don't go away at one, they never go away, and they'll just be there for the rest of your life, always holding back or affecting your brain, especially in people that are unusually gifted in certain areas.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, do you see specific retained reflexes in like coinciding with particular behaviors?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, because again, all of them alter developmental trajectory, and they start very low in the brainstem. That's where they come from. So I have not seen that there are particular reflexes more related to particular conditions or right versus left, or, there is some correlation with symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Certain reflexes may be more prevalent with certain symptoms versus others. But for the most part, it's if they're there in any combination, they're interfering with the normal development of the brain. And then that's superimposed on what else is happening and the person's normal traits and all of that.
So, in somebody who perhaps had chronic illness for a lengthy period of time, is it possible to then lose some of those, reflexes after you've developed properly?
You mean, can some of these reflexes come back?
Exactly.
Yes. So there's not only retained reflexes, there is what's called returned reflexes.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the primitive reflexes, as doctors, we're trained to look at things like the Babinski reflex, which we know is that if you have a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, that the Babinski reflex will come on, or other reflexes known as upper motor neuron signs or pathological reflexes. So in a brain injury, they may return. We also know that there's something called frontal release signs, which means that when the brain degenerates, and the frontal lobe in particular degenerates, that many of these reflexes may come back. So in elderly people,
Mm-hmm.
people with frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's, these reflexes like rooting and sucking reflexes may come back. And so, there are returned reflexes. But if someone just gets sick, or if somebody, has a mild traumatic brain injury and it's not really causing true brain damage, or if they have a real traumatic emotional event, typically that doesn't make the reflexes come back. Usually once they're integrated, unless there's like a true brain injury, or unless there's real severe dementia, they usually don't return.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us a little bit. I know that the very typical path for a parent who gets a child diagnosed with autism, they'll send them down the pathway of ABA or occupational therapy. Tell us a little bit about why the Melillo method differs from ABA and occupational therapy.
Yeah, I always say that it's not about exactly what you do or the tools you use. It's about how you use them that matters. And I think, some of occupational therapy is very good. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of ABA. I don't think it makes much sense, but I know in some cases, it can help. But first of all, most of them, neither one of them are really addressing the root cause properly. Most OTs are not really looking at primitive reflexes. They're not trained to do that. And they may look at it in some. They look at it more than most other professions. Some PTs do, chiropractors do, but they're not really looking at it, and they may not address them in the right way. But also, they don't understand the idea of this balance and the hemispheric imbalance. If you have an imbalance in a system and you stimulate that system equally on both sides, it doesn't correct the imbalance. If anything, it may activate the strong side more than the weak side, and that may make that imbalance worse. So they're not addressing it to try to make any specific correction in the brain. They're really more trying to they're trying to manage certain symptoms or limitations or behaviors in the child, and that's okay, but it's not addressing the core issue. It's just managing things. ABA, again, they're just trying to modify behavior without really understanding why the behavior isn't there to begin with. And, they're not really addressing any of the core root issues. And in many cases, one of the main areas of my research, especially in the past 10 years, has really been to try to understand why a kid with autism, why some kids don't speak. No one's ever explained that anywhere. Mm-hmm. No one's ever really addressed that appropriately. And I really wanted to understand that. And I started looking at this like 25, 30 years ago. But really in the past few years, I've come to really understand that. And what we see is that in these kids that are not speaking, all the words are there. They know everything. They're geniuses with their left brain, but they don't feel their body. They can't control their body. And so they don't have control over their movements, and they don't really feel their body, and they're not building these maps in their brain. And so therefore they can't speak, or they can't point, or they can't write or type. And what happens is in ABA, they often assume that they don't know anything and that they're not there at all. And that, we're going to try to teach you by getting you to do things or by pointing to things. But these kids can't move when you ask them. They can't point where they want to. And they know it all. And we're trying to teach them these things, and it can be very, very frustrating for them. And they talk about that. So, it's there's a big difference, as well as, we also address everything. So we don't just look at just physical activity. We look at, primitive reflexes, core stability, strengthening, balance, vestibular, oculomotor, sensory stimulation, sound, light, vision, hearing, smell, taste, vibration, all of that we work with. But then we also look at auditory processing, visual processing, smell processing, vestibular, And then we also look at cognitive abilities like reading, word reading versus reading comprehension. We work on cognitive skills. We do neurofeedback. We work on activating and changing brain waves in networks. We also look at really detailed neuroimmunology and really understand the neuroimmunology and the diet and nutrition and why they have a leaky gut and why they have overproduction of antibodies. Why did they get autoencephalitis? Why do they get PANS or PANDAS? What's the root cause of that? And how do we deal with that? And then wrap that all together and use many of these modalities together, really addressing specific areas of the brain.
Yeah, I love that because I think so often, as a parent of a PANS child, 13 plus years ago, we really had to kind of piecemeal everything together. But it sounds like you really have put together a much more comprehensive approach where, we're not only looking at the neuroinflammatory markers and those kinds of things that might be, a key trigger for that particular child, but we're also addressing, okay, now perhaps that the child's been inflamed for, a substantial amount of time. How do we then catch up the development once the inflammation goes away? So I think that's so important. Okay. I have to ask though, what is it that brought you to all of this work in the first place?
Really, all three of my kids had issues developing. I was always interested as a clinician. I was an athlete growing up, and I was very much into sports and exercise and diet and nutrition at an early time. And so I gravitated toward chiropractic because that's what always helped me as an athlete the most. When I was there, I fell in love with neurology and rehabilitation, and I wanted to have some sort of kind of sports medicine approach to neurology and brain issues and combine that with diet and nutrition. That was what I wanted to do from the very beginning. And I from the very beginning I got a diplomate in neurology and then rehabilitation. And so I was doing that at a high level in the first 10 years of my practice, and I started to teach it and do research into it. And then my older son was diagnosed with ADHD, and I didn't work with children a lot at that point. But my first thing as a rehab neuro person was, well, what is ADHD? What's happening in the brain? And I went around to a lot of people that I hoped would know, psychiatrists, psychologists, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists. No one could give me an answer as to what the problem was. But they also were really quick to tell me that there wasn't anything I could do about it anyway, which didn't make sense to me. I said, you just told me you don't know what it is, but you're sure we can't change it. Well, yeah, that's the way we look at it. So I dove into the research myself and became kind of obsessed with it as a father and a clinician. I compiled all the research. I connected with some of the top researchers in the world and found the answers and put them into a textbook that took me 10 years to write. Along the way, I developed a program of not only to help my own son, but to start helping other children. And that evolved first into the brain balance program, and then it evolved into the Melillo method, which is when I really wanted to work with kids that, and not just kids, but adults with the most severe developmental, neurological, mental health issues that existed. And that's where we are now. So that's really where my passion stems from.
Tell us a little bit about some of your success stories, some of the people and what they've gone on to do maybe as adults.
Oh, God. There's so many of them. It's hard to figure out. We add a lot of them in my books. But really incredible things where, because these kids are so gifted in almost all cases, if we look at even, the people that have overactive right brain dominance. My daughter's like this. She is she basically had dyslexia as a kid. She struggled with some academics and writing and handwriting and spelling and all of that. But she was a good athlete. She was very social. And also at around 9, 10, she just started writing songs out of nowhere. she was, really, she started singing when she was born. I mean, she sang, I think, before she could speak. And so went down the road with that. And, she did okay. I was able to work with her, even though she hid a lot of the things. But, what a lot of those people suffer from is social anxieties. They're over aware. There's a network called the salience network that we see overactive in dyslexia, which is an overactive right brain, underdeveloped left. And they overread facial expression and body posture. And so they always feel like people are judging them, and they judge themselves harshly. They're hypersensitive to other people's emotions. And it can be overwhelming for them, and it increases the stress response. They can have an over sense of fear or danger, and they, can really feel nervous that bad things are going to happen all the time. And this can also lead to things later on in life, like imposter syndrome, or, feeling like, or procrastination, or hopelessness. And, depression and bipolar are a big part of this, eating disorders, cutting. And so, my daughter, as an example, struggled with a lot of that growing up. But we were able to work with her, and she ended up, she's a singer songwriter, and Zach Brown actually produced her album, and she is now in Nashville, and she's doing great. She's killing it. She's doing really well in that. And she felt that this was so important of the struggles that she went through, that now we have a podcast we do together called the Right Brain, WRITE Brain Podcast, where we've had some of the top songwriters and performers in the world in Nashville come on, and they all talk about the same struggles and the same issues and the same anxieties and insecurities that they struggle with. And many of them had learning disabilities or dyslexia as a kid. Like Ed Sheeran had terrible dyslexia, right? Still does. So these are some things. And we have so many stories like that of people that, and again, right now, the biggest miracles are the kids that end up speaking, that would have never spoken before. Really relate things to us in incredible ways. I have a kid from 8 years old from New Zealand that we work with. This child, didn't say a word. They didn't think he knew one letter. When he was able to start spelling with somebody, the first questions he asked were around quantum physics. And he wanted to, he was coming up with all these phrases that his mother said to him, what is this word? I don't know what this word is. And he would type out a definition. One day she brought it to a friend of hers who was a physicist and said, what is this word in this definition? What do you think of this? And he read it and he said, this is a really good definition of this word. This is a physics term. And yeah, this is really good. And she said, my 8-year-old non-speaking son wrote it. And he said, that's no way. There's no way that he would know that. And she said, well, I didn't write it. And so these kids are brilliant. They're incredible. And that's why we fight so hard to be able to, try to give them that voice. For me, my mission in life now is really understanding at the highest level and working with these nonverbal kids that are brilliant, trapped in a body that they can't feel and they can't control, and to try to give them a voice without losing their genius.
Absolutely. I think that's hugely important. I've got several patients that I'm working with now that are spellers, and they've been utilizing, letter boards with their spelling partners. And the amount of intelligence that these kids had, and, they would have been shoved in a day program for the rest of their life and never had the opportunity to express themselves. So I love those stories. I think it's hugely important. And it's funny that you were talking about this other child, because my son was actually hyperverbal. So thankfully, I had I had him to be able to communicate with me. However, at 4 years old, he was telling me what a particle accelerator was. So I didn't always understand what he was trying to communicate. So,
I love, right? I love that. And my
yeah.
son, who's a doctor with me now in my office, was, on the spectrum as a young kid. And he was like that. He would say these things and he was so curious about certain science things, but yet, he wasn't reading social cues and he was obsessive and compulsive and hyperactive. But now he works with me and he loves those kids because he's like, Dad, I know how they think. I mean, I still think like that inside, and he's like, I love these kids that are telling me, what a black hole is when they're 5 years old.
So, what is next for yourself, for the Melillo method? What kind of legacy are you hoping to provide for some of these kids that are newly diagnosed and coming down the pipeline?
Well, first, yeah, obviously, I want to bring the information that we have and the research that we've done and try to change things. One of the things, one of our goals was pediatricians used to look at primitive reflexes, and they don't. They used to pay attention to milestones, and they don't. They even tell people they don't matter anymore, right? So I want to change that. And the good thing is that that's usually not very easy. But recently, a few months ago, one of the major pediatric clinical journals reached out to us, me and my lab partners, and said, we're getting inundated with questions now all of a sudden about people asking about primitive reflexes, and everybody's interested in it. And, so we wanted to wonder why all of a sudden over the past year or so, all this interest. And we traced it back to you and your research and your work and all the papers you published in the last couple of years. And they said, so we want you to be able to write a paper about it and put it in our journal. So we just published that paper a couple of weeks ago, and basically talking about looking at primitive reflexes as an early biomarker of neurodevelopmental delay. And so hopefully something like that, an average pediatrician will read it and go, wow, this is pretty cool. How do I learn more? And how do I go and start doing this in my practice? That alone, if they just learn to identify the reflexes early and how to be able to intervene, that alone, I think, would be a huge difference in the world and in the outcomes of these kids. But one of the biggest areas right now that I'm really interested in, and I think is an exploding area, is the area of neuroimmunology and looking at things like PANS and PANDAS from a neuro perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, neuroinflammation. Where does neuroinflammation come from? Where does it start? And more is coming out that it's really directed by the brain and by the brainstem. And there's actually a term now in neuroimmunology called immunoception. So we know about interoception, and we know that that's very low, and that plays a big role. Like, we know that kids that are on the autism spectrum and the non-speaking end of it, they usually have a very high pain threshold. They don't feel temperature really the same. They may not feel when they have to go to the bathroom. They may not feel tired. They may not feel hunger and thirst at a normal level. And they don't have normal smell and taste. They don't have that basic. And that comes from an area in the right brain called the insula. So we also know that when they don't have that, then they don't develop proprioception. They don't really feel their body. They don't develop a sensory map called a homunculus in their parietal lobe. And then they don't develop a motor map. And that to me is actually why they don't speak, because they don't have that level of connection. But now there's research that insula not only does interoception, but that's also where immunoception comes from, meaning that the insula and the brain and the central autonomic network monitor inflammation and trigger anti-inflammation in the body in a reflexive way. And so that what we see is that the right brain is more parasympathetic and more anti-inflammatory. The left brain is more sympathetic and inflammatory. So when we get a kid, let's say, and these reflexes come from the brainstem, and in that brainstem is also the autonomic nuclei. that create the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we know that, the parasympathetic is where, through the vagus nerve, is where we sense inflammation, where we send it up into the brain and into the brainstem. That's what triggers what we call sickness behavior, like getting a fever, getting sick, getting malaise. And that then triggers an anti-inflammatory response by the HPA axis, and that triggers like corticosterone and everything. And then that is regulated by the insula and the orbital frontal cortex. So the way this plays a role, there needs to be a lot more research into this. But this is a really exciting area that I think really brings all of this together, like looking at PANS and PANDAS. What is the source of it? Why do they develop these autoantibodies? Why do they attack the brain and the basal ganglia? What are they doing? What's the initiator? Typically it's been previously believed that it starts in the gut and with inflammation, but it really starts in the brainstem, and the brainstem's regulation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Like, most people don't realize that we all start off life with a leaky gut. That's the way we're supposed to start off. It's not that a leaky gut happens typically. It's that it doesn't close up because it doesn't mature, because the parasympathetic nervous system is what does that. So just things like that. I think that's where a lot of my future is going to go, into that area, and try to understand that at the deepest level.
Yeah, I think that's, hugely important. I think conventional, treatments in the past have really focused on killing pathogens, for example, in PANS and PANDAS. And that approach for us was not the solution, because you kill off a pathogen, but then you get exposed to them, every day, all day, throughout living life. You can't just live in a bubble. So, and identifying that mechanism then within the brain that is creating, those autoantibodies and creating the things that are impacting the brain, I think is hugely important research. So as a parent, I'm grateful that you're interested in that.
Yeah, if someone's interested in, we just did a major lecture with two of my colleagues. One of them is really, really great in advanced functional immunology, and the other one is really in looks at proprioception, and it's called immunoception, interoception, and proprioception. And we just did an advanced lecture that is available online, where people can really learn this stuff in really cool way. It's very, very fascinating.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Melillo, at the end of every podcast, I ask every single one of our guests 8 rapid fire questions. These are just fun, designed to give us a little bit of insight into who you are and what makes you tick. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm excited.
All right. Number 1, if you could choose only one natural remedy for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Wow, that's a big question. I know, I would say vitamin D, probably.
Wonderful. And tell us something most people don't know about you.
Um, I don't know. People know a lot about me, but I think I don't know that. I don't know. I can't sing like my daughter. I'm not sure. I think most people don't know I'm a very right brain dominant person. I think people think, because of my research and books, that I'm probably more left brain, but I'm actually very right brain dominant.
Number 3, if I were to compile a playlist of happy music, what song would you suggest be added?
Um, I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan, but he doesn't play a lot of happy music per se. But I like a lot of Motown music. I think that stuff, my wife loves it. It makes you move. So, some old Motown music would kind of do it for me.
Awesome. Number 4, what is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Um, Probably pasta. I'm Italian,
Mm.
and I grew up really Italian with great Italian food. So, like, spaghetti and meatballs, with sauce. I try to limit my carbs, but that's something that, it's hard for me to resist.
All right. What is the most influential book you've ever read?
Um, there's two really, but one would probably be Brain Asymmetry by Richard Davidson and Kenneth Hugdahl. It was like a compilation of all of the greatest research on looking at brain asymmetry and right brain, left brain, by all the masters. And there was a book that came out in the early 90s, and it just blew my brain. It blew my mind and really set me on this path. Another one is a book called Eye of the Vortex by a guy named Rodolfo Linus, who really looked at, evolution of the brain and function of the brain and how it related to how the brain really communicates and functional connectivity. Those two really influenced me more than anything.
Awesome. And what does the word revolution mean to you?
To me, it means changing a paradigm that's been accepted, really overthrowing a lot of the accepted mainstream type of ideas and creating a whole new path. So in many ways, I guess my whole career, I've been pretty revolutionary.
And what does the word remedy mean to you?
Remedy means, fixing the root cause. It doesn't mean modify. It doesn't mean manage symptoms. It doesn't mean, why did something happen? It's not just about fixing it. What caused it to begin with, and how do we prevent it? So prevention is a remedy for me too, but it all comes down to really understanding what is the core problem.
And lastly, if you could impart one piece of wisdom onto our listeners, what would that be?
Well, if we're dealing with parents of kids with issues, one is never lose hope. Don't give up. Don't listen to most of what's told in the mainstream. Probably 99% of it is wrong, actually based on really the most leading edge science, and go with your instincts. Most parents, I think, know. I get parents that come in and they tell me, like when we say to them, when their kid spells, and everybody else said, your child doesn't know anything. They're completely clueless. They're not in there. They're intellectually disabled. In their gut, they know that's not true, right? But they have everybody telling them. And then when they spell and all of a sudden this genius comes out, they're like, I knew it. I knew that what my child was in there. Just, you're right. Go with your gut. If somebody can't explain to you what is actually happening in your child's brain and what is actually causing their symptoms, I would look for somebody else. And most people, again, that's their gut instinct of the parent. This person doesn't know what they're saying. And you're usually right.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Melillo, where can people follow up with you and follow the work that you're doing?
My website, drrobertmelillo.com, has just about everything on it. Advanced courses for clinicians, educational things for parents. A lot of my scientific papers are out there. I've published over 100 papers. I have a degree in neuropsychology. I also have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. We have, all those papers are open access, and many of them are available through my, and books and all the tools that we use in our center. I'm very active on Instagram and put a lot of information out there all the time. I'm over 1 million followers now. So at Dr. Robert Melillo on Instagram and Facebook, so they can reach out to me there. And I have 8 best-selling books that are out there available as well. So there's a lot of material out there. As I said, I have the podcast with my daughter. I have my own podcast called the Melillo Method Podcast, Everything Brain. So there's a lot of ways to reach us. And we have 2, very active practices that I'm in, and I see patients in our 2 offices in New York, on Long Island, and in New York City. And we're available to see patients.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Melillo. For those of you listening, I will just reiterate, Disconnected Kids really helped me identify some of the issues that my son was having and give us some comprehensive tools to be able to help him. So I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Melillo. I'm very glad we had this opportunity to connect. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.
With hope as a guiding light, through darkest days we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth, Remedy Revolution is here for you.